Hello. Welcome to another video on our channel. Here, we translate testimonies from people who have had near-death experiences and other spiritual experiences. Today, let's learn the story of Serafina Caldwell. She says that she died, went through a tunnel and met God, who turned out to be not what we believed. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Leave a comment with your name and city. Let's now listen to Serafina's testimony. My name is Serafina Caldwell, and the story I'm going to share with you completely changed my life. I'm a sex therapist, a profession that requires both empathy and logic. For years, I based my life and career on science, leaving little room for questions of faith or spirituality. My life in Houston was exactly how I wanted it. A successful career, a happy marriage to David, and a clear-cut worldview. That all changed when David accepted a job offer at a university in Lubbock, Texas. At first, I was apprehensive. Lubbock seemed so different from Houston, smaller, more conservative, with a slower pace of life. But, out of love for my husband, I decided to embrace this change. Upon arriving in Lubbock, I was assigned to head the psycho-oncology unit at a university medical center. It was a completely different job than what I was used to. Dealing with cancer patients, especially children, on a daily basis was emotionally draining. This experience began to shake my convictions. For the first time, I began to question the existence of a loving God. Little did I know that these reflections were just the beginning of a much greater transformation that was to come. A transformation that would begin with an event that almost took my life, but that, paradoxically, gave me a new reason to live. It was Saturday, April 19th, Holy Saturday. Work on the psycho-oncology unit had been particularly intense that week, and I decided to go to the local gym to release some of the built-up stress. It was a day like any other, or so I thought. While doing a weight training exercise, I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my neck. I had never felt anything like this before. It was as if someone had stuck a knife into the base of my skull. The pain spread quickly, and within seconds, I began to lose control of the right side of my body. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't respond. A cold sweat came over me, and my vision began to blur. At that moment, I realized something was terribly wrong. I tried to call for help, but the words wouldn't come out. It was like my brain was disconnected from the rest of my body. People around me realized something was wrong and quickly called an ambulance. As I waited, lying on the cold gym floor, terrifying thoughts ran through my mind. What if I died there? What if I never saw David again? What if everything I worked for ended at that moment? When paramedics arrived, they acted quickly. I vaguely remember being placed on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance. The lights were bright and the sirens were deafening. I tried to focus on the paramedics' voices, the questions they asked, but it was difficult to stay conscious. At the hospital, I was immediately taken to undergo a series of tests, CT scans, MRIs. It all seemed like a blur. The doctors spoke quickly among themselves, using terms that I knew from my medical training, but which at that moment seemed like a foreign language. Finally, the diagnosis came: a severe brain bleed. The doctor's words echoed in my mind. There is so much blood accumulated that we don't know if you will survive the night. At that moment, I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I, who had always had control over my life, was now completely at the mercy of fate. The hours that followed the diagnosis were the longest of my life. The pain was constant and intense, as if my brain was being crushed inside my skull. The doctors worked frantically to try to stabilize my condition, but I could hear the desperation in their voices. To make matters worse, most of the neurosurgeons were out of town for the holiday. The only one available was a family friend, Dr. William Prescott, who had already retired. When he arrived at the hospital, he didn't try to soften the gravity of the situation. We can try to stabilize her, but the chances are slim. Serafina may not survive the next 24 hours. Those words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was losing complete control over my destiny. The thought of dying, of leaving David, my family, my patients, it was unbearable. As I was transported by ambulance to another hospital with better resources, the pain was so intense that I began to do something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. It wasn't an elaborate prayer, just a desperate plea for help. God, if you exist, help me. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. Suddenly, I felt a wave of peace and tranquility wash over me. It was as if, in some inexplicable way, I knew that no matter what happened, everything would be okay. This feeling was so strong and so contrary to everything I was experiencing physically that I couldn't ignore it. That night, before surgery, I was lying in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and wires, struggling to breathe, when something extraordinary happened, something that would challenge everything I believed until then and would forever change my perception of reality. What happened next is something I have difficulty describing in words. As a scientist, I have always looked for logical explanations for everything, but what I experienced that night defied all logic I knew. I was lying in the hospital bed, feeling every beat of my heart as if it were my last, when I saw a light. It was no ordinary light. It was intense, ethereal, almost as if it were alive. This light appeared in the upper right corner of the room, and I felt irresistibly drawn to it. Suddenly, I felt my body detach from physical reality. It was as if I were floating, free from all the pain and fear I had felt moments before. I was drawn to this light, and as I got closer, I entered a space completely unlike anything I had ever experienced. This space was illuminated, but not in a way that could be compared to any earthly light. Everything around me was a soft shade of pink, with no visible walls or boundaries. The sensation was one of infinite expansion, as if I were immersed in an ocean of light and love. It was at that moment that I felt a presence. I can't describe it in physical terms as it wasn't something I could see with my eyes. It was a presence that I felt with my entire being, a presence that I can only describe as divine, like God. This presence enveloped me completely, holding me in an embrace that transcended any human notion of love or comfort. It was a pure, unconditional love, so intense that it seemed to fill every part of my being. In that moment, all the fears, all the doubts, all the worries simply disappeared. Then I heard, or rather, felt, a message. These were not spoken words, but a deep understanding that formed within me. The message was clear. It was not my time to die. I had to go back. The disappointment I felt was overwhelming. I wanted to stay. I wanted to remain in that place of pure, non-human love. The idea of returning to the physical world, with all its pain and limitations, seemed unbearable. It was then that the divine presence asked me a question. If I had ever loved someone in the same way I was being loved at that moment. With a lump in my throat, I realized the answer was no. I had never experienced or given such pure and unconditional love. At that moment, I understood that my journey on earth was not complete. There was more to learn, more love to give and receive. With a mixture of reluctance and acceptance, I felt my consciousness being pulled back into my physical body. The return to physical reality was abrupt and disorienting. One moment I was immersed in infinite light and love. The next I was back in my aching body in the hospital bed. The transition was jarring, like being ripped from a wonderful dream to wake up in a nightmare. I opened my eyes to see David beside me, shaking me gently. He looked worried and exhausted. "Serafina," he said, "the doctors need to know if you want to go through with the surgery. It's risky, but it might be your only chance." At that moment, I felt a certainty that I couldn't explain. I looked into David's eyes and said, with a conviction I had never felt before, "I'm not going to die." He seemed surprised by my confidence, but nodded, holding my hand tightly. The surgery was a success, but the days that followed were a constant struggle. Physically, My body was recovering, but emotionally, I was in turmoil. The experience I had was so vivid, so real, that I couldn't just dismiss it as a dream or drug-induced hallucination. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel echoes of that light, that unconditional love. It was as if a part of me had stayed in that ethereal place, and now I was torn between two worlds. The doctors were impressed with my recovery, calling it miraculous. But for me, the real miracle was not the physical healing, but the internal transformation that was happening. As I recovered, I began to question everything I believed before. My purely scientific view of the world now seemed incomplete, unable to explain what I had experienced. I began looking for answers in places I had never considered before. Books about near-death experiences, religious texts, consciousness studies. But the more I searched, the more I realized that no explanation could completely capture what I had experienced. It was something that transcended human words and concepts. In the months following my near-death experience, I faced one of the most difficult periods of my life. As my body healed, my mind and spirit felt like they were at constant war. The depression that hit me was overwhelming. It wasn't just sadness, it was a deep emptiness, a sense of loss that seemed to consume my entire being. I was mourning, not for the life I almost lost, but for the transcendental experience I left behind. I woke up every morning with a weight on my chest, a longing for that light, that loving presence that I had experienced. The world around me seemed pale and dull in comparison. The things that once gave me pleasure, my work, my hobbies, even my relationships now felt empty and meaningless. David, my husband, did his best to support me, but I knew he didn't fully understand what I was going through. How could I? I could barely understand it myself. I tried to explain to him what I had experienced, but words seemed inadequate, unable to capture the depth of what I had experienced. I began to constantly question myself about the purpose of my life. If I had experienced something so extraordinary, why was I sent back? What did God, if it was God I had found, want from me? These questions plagued me day and night, making it difficult to focus on anything. My newfound faith, which had initially felt like a comfort, now became a source of confusion and anguish. I longed for that divine connection I had experienced, but it seemed impossible to achieve it again in the physical world. I tried to go back to work, hoping that the routine would help me get through this phase, but I found myself unable to connect with my patients in the same way as before. How could I help them with their problems when I myself was struggling to find meaning in my own existence? There were times when I wondered if it would have been better not to have come back. The guilt I felt over these thoughts only increased my depression. I knew I should be grateful to be alive, to have been given a second chance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something precious and irreplaceable. It was a time of intense darkness, where each day felt like a struggle to simply continue to exist. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change inside me. A small light began to shine through the darkness, reminding me of the promise I had made in that space beyond life, the promise to learn to love unconditionally. The road to healing was long and difficult, full of ups and downs. It wasn't a linear process. There were days when I felt almost normal, followed by weeks of deep depression. But gradually, I began to find ways to integrate my experience into my everyday life. One of the first things I did was seek professional help. As a therapist, I knew the importance of seeking outside support. I found a psychologist who specialized in near-death experiences, and our sessions were instrumental in helping me process what had happened. At the same time, I began to explore spiritual practices that I previously would have dismissed as superstition. Meditation, prayer, yoga. It's all become part of my daily routine. These practices helped me find moments of peace and reconnect, however briefly, with that feeling of unconditional love I experienced. Slowly, I began to realize that the experience was not something to be mourned, but a gift to be slowly unwrapped. Each day brought a new understanding, a new perspective on life and love. David was my pillar throughout this process. His patience and unwavering love constantly reminded me of what was important. I began to see our relationship in a new light, appreciating the depth of the love we shared in a way I never had before. Over time, the pain of separation from that transcendental experience began to subside, replaced by a deep gratitude for having had the opportunity to experience it. I realized that my task was not to mourn the loss of that moment, but to bring some of that light and love into my everyday life. After months of physical and emotional recovery, I finally felt ready to return to work. I returned to the psycho-oncology unit, but quickly realized that I was no longer the same therapist I had been before. My approach to patients had changed profoundly. Before, I viewed them primarily through the lens of science and psychology. Now, I saw them as souls on a journey, each with their own unique path of growth and learning. One of my first patients upon my return was Rachel, a young woman battling aggressive cancer. She had been my patient before my incident, and when we met again, I felt that our relationship had changed. I saw her not just as a patient, but as a soul-seeking piece just like me. During our sessions, I began incorporating elements of spirituality and mindfulness, along with traditional therapy techniques. To my surprise, many patients responded positively to this new approach. They seemed to feel that I could understand their suffering in a deeper way. My near-death experience gave me a new perspective on life and death. I could talk about death not with fear, but with calm acceptance. This has brought great comfort to many of my terminally ill patients and their families. However, not everything was easy. Some colleagues looked skeptically at my new approach. There were times when I doubted myself, wondering if I was crossing professional boundaries by incorporating spiritual elements into my work. But the results spoke for themselves. My patients were responding well, many reporting a significant improvement in their quality of life, even in the face of difficult prognoses. I realized that my experience wasn't just for me, it was something I could use to help others in a unique and powerful way. My belief in God, which had previously been non-existent, now became the foundation of everything I did. But it was not a blind or dogmatic faith. It was a faith based on experience, a deep conviction that there is something greater than us, something that loves us unconditionally. I began to see God not as a distant, unattainable entity, but as a living, constant presence, connected to each of us in ways that our limited minds have difficulty understanding. This new perspective brought a sense of abundance to my life, a never-ending desire to help others find the same peace I had experienced. However, this journey of faith has not been without challenges. There were days when I questioned whether I had really experienced what I remembered, or whether it was all just a creation of my desperate mind. Doubt, I realized, was an integral part of faith. I started exploring different spiritual traditions, looking for points of connection between them. I realized that at the heart of many religions was a common truth, that of a divine love that transcends our human understanding. My relationship with David has also evolved. He, who had always been more open to spirituality than me, now became my partner on this journey of discovery. Together, we explore different spiritual practices, discuss philosophy and theology, and support each other in our moments of doubt. Living according to the principles I had experienced in that light was not easy. The world often seemed cruel and unfair, especially in my work with cancer patients. But now I had a new perspective. I could see beyond the immediate suffering, understanding that every life, no matter how brief, has a purpose in the grand scheme of things. Today, I see my work and my life with new eyes. I'm still a therapist, I still help people navigate their lives, but now I do it with a renewed compassion, with the awareness that there's something bigger at play, something that connects us all in ways we've only begun to understand. The near-death experience gave me an invaluable gift, the understanding that even in the midst of suffering and pain, there is a greater love, a greater purpose, and that's why I continue, every day, to try to live in accordance with that truth, helping those who come to me find the peace and love that I experienced that day. My work now extends beyond the hospital walls. I began giving talks about my experience, sharing my story with people from all walks of life. It's amazing to see how many people connect with my narrative, how many find comfort and hope in my words. I also started writing a book about my journey. It's a challenging process, trying to put something so deep and personal into words. But I feel it's important to share this experience, to offer a different perspective on life and death to those who are searching for answers. My relationship with David continues to be a source of strength and inspiration. Together, we have explored new ways of living our spirituality on a daily basis. We began volunteering at a local hospice, offering comfort and support to people in their final moments. It's difficult work, but incredibly rewarding. Looking back on that day at the gym that changed everything, I feel deep gratitude, not for the brain bleed itself, of course, but for the journey it set in motion. Every challenge, every moment of doubt and despair has brought me to where I am today. I know my journey is far from over. I still have a lot to learn, a lot of love to give. But now, I face each day with a new perspective, with the certainty that we are all part of something bigger, all connected by a love that transcends our understanding. My near-death experience wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. And I'm excited to see where this path takes me next, always looking for ways to share that unconditional love I've experienced with everyone I cross my path.